Hello and welcome to the final video for Unit 1. Now this isn't technically going over any of the subject knowledge that you need to know, but it's making you think about what you've learned and think about the key question of why did Weimar survive the crisis years of 1918 to 1923. So this is going to be slightly different to the other PowerPoints. It's going to try and get you to revise and think about these key questions rather than looking just at new knowledge. Okay, so the first thing I'd like you to do is use this as a revision task to come to some judgments. Now, you've probably already got the sheet that looks like this at the end of your Unit 1 notes in your content book. This is a really great activity that makes you think about your own judgments and your own views on different situations. So, for instance, we can see here with the first one, it's talking about the event of the setting up of the Weimar Republic, and it gives you two different comments. The idea is that you pick which one you agree with and you explain why. So, for instance, two different judgments about the setting up of Weimar could be the fact that many of the old elite were prepared to support the new regime was promising, so a kind of glass half full idea there, or the initial support from the elite from the new regime was purely tactical and might be ominous for the prospects for future secure democracy. So up to you what you think. The idea is it's making you think, would you suggest setting up of the new republic was promising, or would you see it as quite ominous for the future that actually the initial support was just tactical? So you think about that and then you could write down some of your ideas. You don't have to do this for every single one. It's just an activity that might get you to kind of consolidate your learning and think about the arguments that you might use in exams. For instance, when it comes to things like the Versailles Treaty, would you say something about, considering the context, the terms of the treaty were understandable, they could have shown greater wisdom, or would you say that the Treaty of Versailles was an act of criminal irresponsibility by short-sighted, vengeful politicians? So just pause the video here, look at these different arguments, and think about which ones you most agree with. There's going to be a few more on the next slide as well. So the instructions, if you're not sure exactly what to do, are all here in this little box. So again, this is carrying on with the same task, getting you to think about a variety of different issues and what your judgments would be on them. For instance, we've got something on the Weimar Constitution, the cat putsch, the communist threat, the causes of hyperinflation, the significance of it, Hitler's Munich Putsch, and overall judgments on Weimar. This one at the bottom is really crucial. This is going to be crucial for today because we're thinking about why did Weimar survive? And here we've got two really important judgments where you have to think about your own ideas. Would you say the fact that the Weimar Republic survived so many crises in its first 4 years suggests it had considerable strengths? Or would you say that although it survived its turbulent first 4 years, it was permanently scarred by the experience and the prospect for democracy was poor? So go through and think about your views on all these different events, but definitely make sure you're really thinking about number 12 and which side of the argument you fall on. Would you say that the Weimar Republic was very strong because we can see it survived? Or would you say that the prospects for democracy were poor? So pause it here, think about your arguments, especially number 12. Really consider that one deeply because it's crucial for this revision video. So throughout Unit 1.1 to 1.4, we've been looking at the problems that were faced by the Weimar governments. Now, we've seen there are lots of different problems, but they can broadly be categorised into the ineffective constitution, the Treaty of Versailles, the left-wing threat, the right-wing threat, and the economic threats to them as well. So there are loads of different problems that they face. Now what I want you to do is to think about which ones were the greatest problems that they faced and why. This is really important because one of the broad types of questions they could ask you for Unit 1 is about what was the greatest threat that they faced. And you would have to come up with an argument. Your argument to get a grade A or B especially would have to be one that is sustained. That is one that starts in your introduction and goes the entire way through your essay into the conclusion. So it's worth doing some of the hard thinking now and maybe making some kind of revision material on it to really consolidate your understanding of the topics. So out of those 5 issues, which one do you think was the biggest threat to the government and why? You might even decide to make an A4 and A3 revision page on this, where you have these different headings and you maybe make some revision notes of key points to use to support those ideas. So for instance, when you're doing about the right-wing threat, you might make some revision notes about the rise of the Nazis, the assassinations, the cat putsch, things like that. And then you might also include your arguments about why that was a threat. Why was the right wing such a powerful threat to Weimar? And then you might move on to doing the same for economic threat. And you might write down some points about hyperinflation and the invasion of the Ruhr and the debt that they were in and the policies of the Weimar government. And then you might also think about what was the impact of the economic threat? Why did that threaten the government? Why was it such a problem for them? So think about your arguments and also think about making some kind of revision material that you can look back on easily to revise this topic. So we've thought about what were the main problems that they faced. Another thing that I want you to think about is, why did the Weimar Republic survive those difficult crisis years? This is a really key historiographical question, and it's one that lots of historians have debated for a long time. Its survival in 1923 was in marked contrast to its collapse 10 years later. So what I'd like you to do before you look at the answers is I'd like you just to pause the video here, brainstorm some ideas. You might have also come up with some different ones to me. I want you to think about, why did it survive? You could think about the different problems it experienced and why it managed to overcome those, or just general reasons why it survived. So pause it here and then we'll look at the answer in a second. Okay, so here are just some of the ideas that you could use if you were having to do a question about why did the Weimar Republic survive. So first of all, you could talk about the fact that even though it was a republic without republicans and there generally wasn't mass support for democracy, generally popular anger was much more directed towards the French and the Allies than it was towards the Weimar Republic itself. They were met with real disinterest, but they weren't necessarily met with anger throughout the whole crisis years. Yes, there was moments of real anger when it came to things like the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, but there was still a lot of anger directed against the Allies rather than just being solely directed at the German government. Another point that you could make about why it survived in 1923, but it didn't with the impact of the Great Depression, is that essentially the workers didn't suffer to the same extent as they had done during the 1930s. Obviously, we know that inflation was pretty terrible for the ordinary German person, and the middle classes especially lost their life savings and never got them returned, but generally there wasn't the same level of suffering as there was during the Great Depression. There wasn't over 6 million people unemployed. It wasn't as bad as that. The third reason we could talk about is the actions of people such as Eber and Stresemann, who helped save the Republic. Eber acted quite decisively in lots of moments, and so did Stresemann as well. We'll talk more about those two in a second on the next slide. So you could even pause it here and try and think yourselves in order to help you revise. What kinds of things did Eber and Stresemann do? If you can't think of anything that they did, then you might want to go back and read over your notes again. Obviously, Stresemann, I'm not talking about him helping particularly in 1918 or anything. For Stresemann here, we're thinking about what did he do in 1923 when he was Chancellor. You might struggle to answer about Stresemann at this point if you haven't yet revised Unit 2, but if you have, hopefully you can think about what did he do in those first 100 days as Chancellor. The next reason that we can think about why did it survive, well, it's basically about the weaknesses of the extremists, the fact that they weren't united together. For instance, if we're thinking about the left wing, well, they hadn't recovered from their divisions and they didn't have enough support. You could even think about the fact that they weakened the level of support by splitting into the SPD and the KPD. You could also think about the extreme right and why they weren't united, the fact that they had different aims and there were so many different small splinter groups. You could talk about the failure of the cat putsch served as a warning to the dangers of taking hasty action, and potentially that might have been why the army didn't make a future move. You could talk about the extreme right and the problems of the Munich putsch and why it failed, and you could have talked about the lack of support there. So there's loads of different things that you can think of within that section of the weaknesses of the extremists. You could divide it into left and right, or you could do it as one section. And the final point is that, yes, there wasn't large-scale support for Weimar itself. People didn't love the idea of democracy, but actually there was no real obvious political alternative. Think about German society, incredibly politically fragmented at this point. You know, when we think about proportional representation, that's a great system in lots of ways. It just didn't suit a public that was so divided politically. And therefore, there was no obvious political alternative to Weimar that was going to unite these extreme left and right-wing supporters and the moderates. So in some ways, Weimar might not have been very popular, but it was the most popular suggestion in comparison to having a government ruled by the extreme left or right. So think about here, why did it survive? What are your main ideas? What would you say on this slide or from your own ideas were the most important reasons why it survived? You might even want to pause here to write a little paragraph about it to consolidate your understanding and your learning. So now I want you to think about bringing that understanding, that consolidation together by looking at an exam question which we've got on the slide here. So the exam question I want you to think about is, why did the Weimar Republic survive? So we've got a question here that says the main reason why the Weimar Republic survived its difficult early years between 1919 to 1923 was due to the skillful leadership of Friedrich Ebert. Explain why you agree or disagree with this view. So here we've got a question asking us, why did Weimar survive? And then we've got the factor being given of the skillful leadership of Ebert. So you could approach this question in so many different ways. This is an example of a really easy plan that I gave you back in year 12 at the end of unit 1. So one way of approaching this question could be to look at different threats and then within those paragraphs assess why it survived. So you could, for instance, talk about the initial actions of the setting up of the Weimar Republic and talk about why the Weimar Republic survived that. You could then talk about the left-wing rebellions and left-wing threat and why the Weimar Republic survived. You could talk about right-wing rebellions and why the Weimar Republic survived, and the economic problems they faced and why they survived. Now, this is one way of approaching this question and approaching this topic. But bear in mind, if you do this and if you do go in this kind of way, you're going to have to make sure your analysis is really good and it's really clear that you're focused on the question that you're linking back and you're thinking within each paragraph about to what extent that was down to the successful leadership of Ebert, or was it down to another factor? So if you did this question this way, like the plan I gave you as an example back in year 12, that's a great idea if you did. But you'd have to make sure within each paragraph you're assessing to what extent it was the leadership of Ebert and to what extent it was other factors. So your introduction would have to be really good, where you introduce the different factors like Ebert's leadership, lack of a strong alternative, weaknesses of the opposition, and things like luck. And then within those paragraphs, you could link it back to those different reasons why Weimar survived that you've introduced in the introduction. That's one way that you could do it. You could also do it a different way and do it more like the stuff on the last slide, where, for instance, you have a few sections on the weaknesses of opposition. So you might end up having a couple of paragraphs on the successful and skillful leadership of Ebert. You might then have some paragraphs about the weaknesses of opposition. And then you might also have a paragraph on Stresemann and his actions during the first 100 days at the end of 1923. So thinking about him forming the Great Coalition, thinking about him ending hyperinflation. I didn't put this on the original plan that I gave you back in year 12, because when I gave it to you, we hadn't yet studied that. So it would have been a bit unfair to expect you to know about that at that point. But you could include it if you wanted. So there's some different ways of approaching that exam question. I think this would be a great one for you to write down that question and have a go at it yourself, even just writing things like an introduction and a conclusion. I mean, you could do it using the plan that I've got on this slide, but I think it might be better for you to have a go answering that question using the different reasons that we had on the previous slide. Things like the weaknesses of opposition, things like the strengths of Abert, the lack of a viable alternative, all those kind of things could be brought into this very broad question. So that's the end of this video, which is just supposed to get you thinking about the key questions of Weimar and bringing it all together. Make sure that you're doing lots of revision now that you've got to the end of Unit 1. Could you go back and do some more of the flashcards if you haven't already made all of them for all 4 of the Unit 1 short answer tests? Could you go back and do some more exam question planning? Could you go back and apply it to some source questions? Remember, in your folders, you've got everything you could possibly need to go and get full marks in those exams. You just need to make a start on it now and making sure that you're applying your knowledge as much as possible. Well done for watching this video.